Pozostając
w dalszym ciągu oczywiście w naszym głównym temacie dotyczącym awangardy.
So, speaking about avant-garde, the next presentation is about the city of the avant-garde, the tall building, by Professor Raffaella Neri, Milano. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, first of all, for your always appreciated invitation to this conference. And just few general words before going to the topic of my speech. It is my belief that the avant-garde architectural movement have always represented a dilemma. Not all the avant-garde schools that we cite in painting, sculpture, or movies or other arts have seen a counterpart in architecture, or they have had one which evolved in a different way. As usual, I think that the reasons are to be found in the specific nature of architecture, in its being a representative art, certainly, but also a practical, utilitarian act, in view of its materiality, construction methods, and techniques, all facts which for a long time excluded architecture from the liberal arts. But above all, for architecture, showcasing any avant-garde expression is limited by its being a realistic art, a positive and affirmative art. Its primary purpose is building places through compositions of volumes and buildings. Architecture cannot build by denial or protest, by denunciation. It cannot be a personal, individualistic, or a subjective expression, as is occasionally claimed by the avant-garde movements. Almost always in architecture, avant-garde movements have focused their attention on expressive and language issues, and in some cases in search of a constructive eloquence to announce the exceptionality of a building through a new formal emphasis. And although expressiveness is a quality absolutely necessary for any work of architecture, it must be understood as the interpretation of a collective value that can be the bearer of general and repeatable principles on which to base the construction of a city. Conversely, we could say that quality architecture is always a forerunner of cultural demands, social, economic, and technical changes. Architecture envisions the city and the construction of the society of the future, of the world to come. It projects them, anticipates them, informs adherent to the reality that will be. So, generalizing a little, it could be said that all good architecture is avant-garde art for its ability to read the changes and direct the physical transformations of reality of our cities and the world we inhabit. In a book entitled Bilancio dell'espressionismo, Evaluation of Expressionism, of the 1965, Giulio Carlo Argan, a well-known Italian critic and historian, argued for the substantial continuity between the values of expressionism, which claimed the spirituality of art in opposition to a purely utilitarian conception, and those of German rationalism, a form of a realist relapse of a movement born from a rather different assumption. So in trying to follow this line of thought, I myself wonder whether it was possible to recognize this continuity from expressionism to rationalism, the contribution of the avant-garde movements of the 20th century to architecture, how these demands had been addressed to the city and realized. And one of the most recurrent themes common to different avant-garde movements concerns reflection around the tall buildings and its role in the construction of the modern city. Certainly born in Europe with avant-garde accents as a novelty and a rupture within the consolidated city, made thinkable by the technical innovation and necessary by urban growth, it saw later repercussions and experiments in distant contexts and movements. Mies van der Rohe's iron and glass Friedrichstrasse skyscraper of 1921 has been placed in the sphere of expressionism due to the provocative aspect of its large volume in relation to the fabric of the medieval city and to the use of new materials, iron and glass, represented in contrast with the extant, in the exaltation of their intrinsic and expressive qualities, transparency, reflections, and heights. In the same year, the architects of constructivism were working on similar themes. The places of the city were identified in their designs by tall buildings which defied the laws of gravity, boasting new materials and new construction techniques. Tatlin, Ginsburg, Lissinsky, and Leonidov entrusted the construction of the revolutionary future Soviet city to the ability to imagine extraordinary buildings. And other avant-garde movements grapple with height, imagining new forms from Erich Mendelssohn, with the famous Einstein Tower in Potsdam, to the Italian Antonio Sant'Elia with his futurist works of architecture proposed for the Città Nuova, the new city. So, is it possible to transform an avant-garde idea, originally resolved in an expressionist, constructivist, or futurist key, into principle underlying the construction of the modern city, the construction of places, and in which way, or in more general terms, does an avant-garde city exist? In his migration from Europe to America, Mies van der Rohe pursued this thought. The tall building in iron and glass was a theme he addressed for the first time in 1921 in the ways we have mentioned, almost as a provocation, disruptive both in its architectural form and in its urban relationships. But I think it was to be America, where the skyscraper was no novelty, but a consolidated type, where cities were built with different rules, where iron and glass had long been building materials, which provided me with opportunities and possibilities to transform this initial expressive insight into works of architecture, into pieces of city that he tested and realized in different contexts, applying himself, above all, to a question which was, I believe, disruptive and avant-garde. The result of European culture induced a new and unexpected vision in the American city. For me, the tall building was not an object to be studied in relation to its possibility of competing with others in being the tallest, as happened in the American downtowns, nor to demonstrate competence or technical audacity, nor only to find new languages. The tall building, like any other piece of architecture, was a means to build places in the city, through the relationship it established with other works of architecture, to define spaces which possess value and form, to build the sense of civitas that has always inspired every civil community in European culture, every grouping of people who have endowed themselves with laws and places for coexistence. But let us see how this idea of a tall building developed. As you know, Mies first tackled this theme in the 50s in New York with the construction of the Seagram building. This is a self-standing building which has to accept the logic of the city block, a unit of measurement in the US of the urban terrain, but without any plan in America. The result was skyscrapers designed as independent objects, structurally of iron and glass, but generally clad in brick to resist the frequent threat of fires, and as a result, resembling masonry construction. So Mies basically introduced two innovations. The first, more obvious one, concerned the formal elements, those which define the actual building. The construction choice became both a technical and an expressive tool. It revealed itself directly in the form of the architectural elements. This construction system presented itself as an ordered set of pillars and lintels and of smaller uprights which brought rhythm to and divided the large panes of glass which Mies used in a coherent way with its own nature, but in a less expressionist way than the Berlin skyscraper. Second, in this context, the real novelty consisted in the intent to define a public square, an open collective space, a city space that was customary in the European tradition, but practically non-existent in the American city, and above all, never previously realized by means of tall buildings. To obtain this space, Mies simply set the tower back from its alignment with the other buildings along Park Avenue. So in this way, a void defined through a slight elevation of the ground level was generated, not really a plinth, but a distinction with respect to the road surface. The axis being emphasized through the positioning of two large symmetrical fountains, a few wide steps, and a canopy sheltering building's entrance. The theme of an urban plaza seems to be the way Mies interpreted the assignment for the construction of the Federal Center in Chicago in 1959 as a seat for the offices of the state of Illinois, which included the Treasury, the funds, Justice departments, the court, and the city central post office. The desire to define a place of relationship and meeting common to several public buildings is evidenced by the studies which Mies conducted before arriving at the definitive solutions. The project area is located inside the Loop, the heart of downtown. The streets which identify the block are all similar to one another without any hierarchy. The area that Mies had available lay between two city blocks, one intact, the other available only for the part overlooking Dearborn Street. Surrounding this, all the other blocks were built up. This initial program seems to have envisaged the construction of two towers. Mies' office developed multiple variants, sketches, and models concerning a different composition of parts. Mies considered that the activities housed in the government offices of the state of Illinois required the construction of a representative place. However, the problem of building a square by means of tall buildings was far from a usual theme and not easy to solve. To work in this direction, Mies separated the post office building from the towers. In this way, the elements involved became three: two towers and a low self-standing building allocated to the post office. This operation allowed the composition of the square by working on an indispensable double scale. The tall building identified the site on an urban scale and protects the free space between the surrounding skyscrapers. The one-story hall introduced a second, smaller measurement comparable with the height of pedestrians, a less looming height, easily gauged by the eye, closer to the human scale. Because beyond a certain height, the size of the tower would have a difficulty bringing proportion to an empty space below. Seen from close to, within a delimited space, its conclusion would be impossible to perceive. For this reason, the towers of the Federal Center, like the nearby skyscrapers, are divided into two parts, a lower one, which borrows the height of the post office and is porticoed, and an upper one consisting of the bulk of the building. In this way, the site of the actual square is measured by the relationship between the post office and the porticoed lobbies of the towers. Above, the volume continues its race toward the sky. Many drawings and models testified the development stages of the projects. We do not precisely know the order of these studies, but we can place among the first solutions a very daring hypothesis. All the activities of the government offices and the court were to be collected in a single skyscraper, 56-story high, aligned along Dearborn Street, similar to that of the just completed SIGRAM. In this case, the post office occupies a large part of the block beyond the street, aligned at its outer limit. Perhaps the free space that resulted from this composition would have seemed to miss too scarcely defined here in the disorder of the skyscrapers that crowded around it. Or perhaps the distinction between the two institutions housed in the tower was not sufficiently clear. Two other hypotheses proposed the two towers arranged parallel to each other and to Dearborn Street. In the first one, a tower is aligned with the street, the other set back to leave a free space between them. The post office would have formed a sort of plinth placed beneath the tower, but independent of its perimeter. In this way, the two skyscrapers seem to build an urban gate straddling the street, but the free space between them was impoverished, and the post office, relegated behind the tower, was excluded from the composition and deprived of its role of a scaling element. In this variant, the post office is again between the towers, but there is no more free space. A third model is the result of the composition of three towers of equal height, spaced apart in order to free up a central space where the post office was supposed to sit. In this case, the free space of the square seems to have become exceedingly small, for the most part occupied by the post office. The final solution was subject to a progressive refinement, of which we know at least two variants. The principle was defined. The tall buildings were arranged in an L shape, the first one aligned with Dearborn Street, the second parallel to Jackson Boulevard, at the limit of the available block. The post office closed off the other open corner. In front of the tower, another block, in another block is the market building of Olaber de Roche, an expression of the first school of Chicago school, which in this way partially participated in defining the site. This solution had the advantage of leaving a large area free between the buildings and seemed to want to emphasize the importance of the two streets by establishing a hierarchy with respect to the others. In the subsequent refinement of the project, which correspond to the solution actually built, the two towers differ in height. The one along Dearborn Street, which houses the offices and 15 rooms of the court, is longer and lower, 30 stories. The one along Jackson Boulevard changed proportions and increased its height, 42 stories. This makes its presence even more manifest along the street and builds a perspective to the very long and central Dearborn Street, which crosses Chicago from north to south, parallel to the lake. In this way, it became a new urban landmark, a tower higher than the surrounding skyscrapers. Mist did not shy away from bringing distinction to the place through the architecture, both by defining the open space between them and by building a hierarchy in stark contrast to the uniformity of the grid. The post office building, a glazed hall with a square ground plan, maintained its position to obtain smaller spaces, hierarchically secondary, apparently leftovers, in reality placed in strategic positions to enrich the composition of other places and other spaces. As in the case of the IIT, in the residential unit of Lakeshore Drive, in the subsequent complexes of the Dominion Center in Toronto, or in the Westmount Center in Montreal. The free and independent buildings which create them allow these shifts and generate the places which develop the composition, always strictly controlled by meaning, reciprocal position, and scale. Thank you very much for your attention.